Welcome to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment Podcast. I'm Priya Sharma, and joining me today is Arjun Gupta.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's important judgment. But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our podcast if you enjoy our daily legal breakdowns.
That's right. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue providing in-depth analysis of the latest court decisions. Now, let's get started with today's cases.
Today's case is a fascinating one. It's a civil appeal in the Supreme Court of India involving 6 appellants who are plaintiffs in a suit for specific performance of a contract.
Before we jump into the specifics, let's define specific performance for our listeners. It's a legal remedy that forces a party to fulfill their contractual obligation, typically when monetary damages wouldn't adequately compensate the other party. So basically, it's like a court order saying, you promised to do this, so you have to do it.
That's right. In this case, the 6 appellants wanted the court to order the defendants to execute a sale deed for a piece of land.
Okay, so what's the backstory?
Well, the dispute involves a piece of land in PoA, Madhya Pradesh, which was originally owned by Sushila Devi. She purchased it in 1966 from Vijay Chatti, and the appellants claim they entered into agreements to buy portions of this land from Sushila Devi in 1990.
So the appellants claim they had agreements to sell with Sushila Devi, but those agreements weren't registered. They also paid the full consideration, which is the agreed-upon price, to Sushila Devi, and took possession of the land.
Right. After Sushila Devi passed away in 1992, the appellants approached her legal heirs, the defendants in the case, to execute the sale deeds. But the defendants refused. Instead, they applied for mutation of their names in the revenue records, basically trying to claim ownership of the land.
Sounds like a big mess.
Absolutely. The appellants then filed separate suits for specific performance, arguing that the defendants were obligated to execute the sale deeds because the appellants had already paid the purchase price and taken possession.
What happened in the lower courts?
The trial court ruled in favor of the appellants. They ordered the defendants to execute the sale deeds and declared the sale deeds executed by the defendants in favor of third parties as null and void. The trial court found that the appellants had proved they had valid agreements to sell with Sushila Devi and that they had paid the full consideration and taken possession.
Interesting. So why did the defendants appeal to the High Court?
The defendants argued that the agreements to sell were invalid because they weren't registered and that the sale price was below the market value, which indicated possible fraud on the part of the appellants. They also argued that the appellants hadn't proved they were in possession of the land.
And the High Court sided with the defendants?
Yes. The High Court reversed the trial court's decision and dismissed the appellants' suits. They found that the appellants hadn't successfully proven the existence of valid agreements to sell or that they were in possession of the land. They also found that the suit was barred by the statute of limitations, which means the appellants had waited too long to file their suit.
That seems like a pretty big deal. The High Court completely overturned the trial court's decision. What were the major legal issues involved in this case?
There were a few key legal questions at play. Was the agreement to sell valid and binding? The High Court found that the appellants hadn't proven the validity of the agreements. They emphasized the fact that the agreements weren't registered, which is a critical requirement under Indian law. Was the appellants' possession of the land sufficient? The High Court found that the appellants didn't provide enough evidence to support their claim of possession. Was the suit barred by the statute of limitations? This was a key point. The High Court found that the appellants had waited too long to file their suit.
It sounds like the High Court applied a pretty strict legal standard in this case.
Yes, and that brings us to the Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court reversed the High Court's decision and upheld the trial court's judgment.
That's quite a reversal. What were the key arguments the Supreme Court considered?
The Supreme Court carefully examined the evidence and arguments presented by both sides. They found that the High Court had erred in a few key areas. The burden of proof. The Supreme Court stressed that the burden of proof for fraud lay on the defendants, who alleged the agreements were forged. However, they failed to provide sufficient evidence to substantiate their claim. The plaintiff's absence from the witness box. The High Court had drawn an adverse inference against the appellants for not personally appearing as witnesses in the case. However, the Supreme Court ruled that the appellants had adequately proven their case through the testimony of their power of attorney holders, who had first-hand knowledge of the transactions. The statute of limitations. The Supreme Court ruled that the statute of limitations didn't bar the appellants' suit because the cause of action arose when the defendants refused to execute the sale deeds, not when the agreements were signed.
So the Supreme Court essentially found that the High Court had placed too much emphasis on technicalities and hadn't given enough weight to the substantive evidence presented by the appellants.
Precisely. The Supreme Court concluded that the appellants had successfully proven the validity of the agreements to sell, their possession of the land, and the defendants' failure to execute the sale deeds.
This is a significant decision with wide-ranging implications. Can you elaborate on those?
Absolutely. This judgment reinforces the importance of specific performance as a legal remedy in cases where monetary damages wouldn't be sufficient. It also underscores that parties must honor their contractual obligations, even if those obligations aren't formalized in a fully registered agreement. The decision also highlights the importance of clear and convincing evidence when it comes to claims of fraud or forgery.
This judgment certainly provides important guidance for future specific performance cases. It also raises a question about the doctrine of lis pendens, a legal principle that prevents property transfer during pending litigation. How does this case relate to that concept?
That's a good point. The Supreme Court didn't explicitly address lis pendens in its decision, but it does have implications. The defendants violated the injunction order issued by the trial court by transferring the property to third parties during the litigation. While the Supreme Court didn't directly address the validity of the subsequent transfers, it found that those transfers did not affect the appellant's rights to specific performance under the agreements to sell.
So the judgment seems to indicate that a subsequent transfer during a pending lawsuit doesn't necessarily invalidate a prior agreement to sell if the original parties are found to be obligated under that agreement.
That's a plausible interpretation. The Supreme Court's decision effectively prioritizes the enforceability of the original agreement to sell over the subsequent transfers, even though those transfers were registered.
This is a case that will definitely be cited in future litigation involving specific performance, especially when the agreements aren't fully registered. It's a reminder that courts will carefully consider the evidence and ensure that the parties fulfill their contractual obligations.
Absolutely. This case reminds us that justice can prevail even in complex situations involving technical legal issues. The Supreme Court's decision reinforces the principle of equitable remedies like specific performance and emphasizes that the law aims to protect the rights of all parties involved.
And that wraps up our analysis of today's judgments. We hope you found our discussion informative and engaging.
Before we sign off, we'd like to remind our listeners once again to like, subscribe, and share our podcast. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you daily updates on the most important legal decisions.
Absolutely. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow for another exciting episode. Until then, this is Priya Sharma.
And Arjun Gupta, signing off. Thanks for listening to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment podcast.